I always say this, a lot of people are going to be very surprised. So Danny was Dennis the Menace when he was younger. He was not serious. He didn't have a serious bone in him. He was a preschooler who loved a stepladder, a mop, and anything to do with sort of big items that he could move around and have. He didn't really get serious at all until he was about 8 or 9 years old. So when people would come in, I had a wallpaper person come in when we moved from one place to the other, and Danny had peeled off all of the wallpaper. And he says to me at the time, Mrs. Markel, this is not a boy for wallpaper, but I want to tell you that my son was like this and he's in med school. And I said later on, as I met people when they had one of these really wild kids, I said, well, guess what? My son was like this too, but he went to Harvard. So that was the sort of in essence, but his early childhood, he was really, really, really quite rambunctious. He loved comics though. So that was really the stage for him to really, really read a lot. And that's how that part of it started.
Yes. And what was his relationship like with his sister? I assume Shelley is at least a couple of years older than him.
She is. She's 3 years older. And he respected her. He loved being, I think, the younger brother. And she really, she really sort of, I don't want to say she took care of him as in care, but, you know, she would say she did his shoelaces, you know, she had extra responsibilities, but they had the 3-year difference was quite substantial in the sense that when Danny was young, she was already in nursery school. We have different things we call things today in terms of the schooling. And so she was out of the house most of the mornings when he was very, very young. And he was very excited for her to come home. Shelley, Shelley, you know, he kept on calling out the window and waiting for her to come. And really that was, I would say that was in essence, his whole life, like where she took the serious responsibility of, you know, when we traveled or different things, she had to close the lights. She knew what to do. And Danny was very, very good at it, but he didn't take it on until he was much older.
Mm-hmm. I see. Was he always a good student?
Well, it's a funny answer. He was a very good student when he was older. When he was younger, he was a good student. He had the highest marks in grade 3 that they did an aptitude test in his school. And they called me in actually. Why is he only getting an A or an A-? This is sort of, so I said he needs another year to simmer down. I would say it in about 10, when he was 10, he really just, you know, shot up the ladder. He was like way, way better in his language development, his problem solving, his curiosity, like everything about him just really, really gelled as he just got that little maturity more. But he was a good student. He almost had, I would say, close to a photographic memory. So I don't know if you played ever with trivia. Do you remember the game's Trivia Pursuit?
Oh yeah.
He practically memorized every card, and he would beat all the kids, you know, at his at any kind of games when they played. And he was fortunate, and he had very, very good talent in writing. So he didn't have to work. He didn't work hard in school until law school, to be honest. I used to tease him. You don't get to the Olympics, and there's a little bit of practice, not just talent. But he was fortunate, really. His writing was excellent in terms of academic writing, but daily writing, you know, like he could write for the USA Today, which he did do, and had a full range of writing skills, which helped him.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And what kind of schools did he go to when he was a child? Did he go to private schools? Yes,
he went to private schools. And then afterwards, in grade 10, he went to a public school in Toronto. And he knew he wanted, so his choice of schools is really important. He only knew from the time, he only wanted, I should say, from the time he was about 11 or 12, he knew he wanted only go to Harvard, Princeton, or Yale. So this was like his choice, and he already had planned it. But what was really significant at that time, first of all, it was much harder for a Canadian student to get into the American universities. Plus, there were no scholarships for undergrad in the earlier parts from Canada, coming from Canada. and he knew exactly what he had to do. So as soon as he was in high school, he really planned his, he became editor of the newspaper. He got the newspaper running again. It was quiet or dead, if you want to call it, for 5-6 years. He got an environmental project going. He was on the debating team. He knew, and Harvard had told us when we first got there as parents in first year and freshmen, they said, we know all the kids are going to have the marks. It's really the leadership stuff that you need. And what was amazing is there was no internet there then, I should say. So he just knew what he needed to do to get there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty amazing. But how did you and his father feel about him wanting to go to the United States and go off to Harvard?
We knew it was going to happen. What was the only thing that there was only one concern? It was he hadn't really applied to any Canadian universities. So one day Phil said, just as he was, really getting down to the final application, says, I think you need a backup plan. Do me a favor, just apply to one place in Canada. And he did. He sort of appeased him, and he did what he was really successful in getting where he wanted to go. We went, when a young child says something to you, like they want to go to Harvard or Princeton or any of these places, if there's some realism, but if you don't want them to go, or you can't afford it, or there's other issues, you don't let it sort of rise as much. So he had a whole, he had a plan, he had expectations, and we never quelched it. So we expected him to go. And truthfully, he left very young. He left by 18, and he never came back to Canada really to live permanently. So his whole life was, American.
Yeah, so after he went off to Harvard, then it sounds like he also lived in the United Kingdom, right, to get his master's degree? And
well, he went, so
Israel.
he finished, so he would have stayed in university his whole life, right? This was the point. So after he finished Harvard undergrad, he went for one year in Israel for a fellowship, and then he went to Cambridge, England, and he did get another master's degree. And then he came back to Harvard Law School in Boston, and he stayed there, and he finished, and then he clerked, and then he worked in Washington.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and then
So
he wound up in Tallahassee of all places. Yeah.
Well, you know what? He wanted to be an academic. When he was working in Washington, he would always say that at one point that he wanted to be a dean of a university, of a law school, which would have been, 10 or 15 years down the road. But he was very, very flexible. Then he lived in New York, he lived in Boston, he lived in London, England, he lived in Arizona, he worked because of the clerking in San Francisco. He made friends all over the world, and he stayed connected with them. That was his major sort of skill and life skill, really. And he always called them, and he had, a whole community of friends. So he kind of was very flexible to be anywhere.
Mm-hmm. I see. Yes, I remember, I think his friend Jason Solomon basically said that too, that Dan was the great connector. He made friends everywhere he went. He put people in touch with each other. He kept in touch with everybody. So, but then how often did you see him though, especially after he moved to Florida?
We saw him frequently because he was Danny's, just this whole point, we're talking about staying connected. He loved the community. He loved coming back to Canada. So right now I'm in what we would call our vacation home, which in the wintertime has skiing, and in the summertime has leisure activities, recreational activities, tennis and swimming and so forth. And he would come back every year for a month. Because don't forget, as he was moving towards academia, there was more flexibility in the summertime. And he came back for all of the Jewish holidays, particularly Passover, where he came to Montreal, because we had a large family there still. And then we would go visit him. So we saw him a lot. And then we also went to New York. He was frequently, let's say if he was working in New York, we visited New York. And he would come from New York to Montreal or Toronto. We saw him a lot. It was not what you would call the typical American, come see your family on Thanksgiving. So it was very much more visiting. I would say in that respect, he had still a very kind of Canadian sort of value system of coming home and seeing everybody all the time, frequently.
Mhm. Oh, that's great. Well, did he also bring his children on these visits, or
Yes,
was it
yes,
more just him?
always, always. The only thing where he changed, so as the point of children, having the children, he didn't like snow anymore, Danny. He used to tease him. I used to say, you know, come and let your children experience winter. And that was no more in the cards. He got very used to warm climates, which Tallahassee in the summertime doesn't get hotter. He lived in Arizona, he lived in Israel. And I used to say, you know, how do you manage it? It's 110, you know, outside. He says, well, it's okay. And if, you know, with the children, he would take them at 6 o'clock in the morning in Tallahassee to the park. So he really worked around both, you know, you call it the climate, the temperature, and his lifestyle.
I see. Yes. And can you tell us also a little bit more about what he was like as a father to his children?
I think of all, you know, as we we're talking earlier on, he had tremendous academic achievements. He had tremendous publishing sort of success. To me, the greatest thing about Dan was his how he was as a father. And he loved the kids, and he was very, I think because he still had such a strong child in him, really. You know, Trader Joe's came to Tallahassee, I'll give you an example. And they just opened up there. And I don't think the boys were older than 4 and 3, if that. And he let them go free in the grocery store towards the cereal boxes so that they could have, you know, all these new choices. And it was hysterical. In fact, I figured every box is going to be on the floor within 2 minutes, but they were a little more disciplined than he was. But he loved the kids. And also he put up their paintings across his living room. He took an old fashioned, if you remember when you would hang up laundry, and most people can't even remember that because everybody had to dry it, but an old fashioned rope, and he would hang their pictures from the center of the room. And one time I teased him and I said, I think you have a new decoration here. It's called preschool decor, because you would just walk in and everything was there. And in addition, if his kids were listening to one of their songs in the car, you couldn't talk. There was no adult conversation. So the children were really his. He was on a pedestal as a father, as far as I'm concerned, but they were definitely treated royally from the attention and the love that he gave them.
Yes, I think I also heard that he would often show pictures of his kids to his students or flash them up on the big screen. So the students had to know what was going on with his children first before the class began. So
I'm sure that's true. And the truth is he was a little bit very overactive, maybe on Facebook. Don't forget, Facebook just came out at that time. And if they were in the park, there were at least like 50 pictures, you know, following the visit. So he was a fan of social media also. He started Crofts blog. So the sort of his interest in the whole issue of availability of social media was very much a part of his personal life at a great length, and also his professional life as well.
Yes. And so I showed you some of those comments or proposed questions from some of my subscribers, and one of them wanted to know more memories that you have of Dan that maybe hasn't been told to the public yet. So is there any other, like, you know, very important memory that you would like to share with people about him?
Well, I have really very beautiful memories of him. I mean, the strongest memories are of a different kind. They're really the things that I try to express that nobody can imagine, which is his early childhood. You know, when he would wander off. Once we went to, I wasn't actually with him, was preschool, 5 years old. He went with Phil and Shelley to the mall, and he hid, you know, in a picture like Macy's, a big department store, and he hid in one of these shirt racks that you can put your body through, and Phil couldn't find him. But because he was drilled, I knew I was in a new city. He was only there for 2 weeks in Toronto from Montreal. He was 5. I drilled him on the phone number, our new number. And he went to a candy kiosk and he said to the lady, he said, I need to call my mother, I'm lost. So he called me and I said, where are you? So he told me I'm in the candy kiosk. So I went and I got him, but by the time, Phil, I think, had a heart attack by that point because he couldn't find him. And then we had to go back and search him. So these are the memories. They're very unique memories, and they're very particular to Dan. You know, when he was a little older, he was 10 and he was into books and reading. I had to take him to a sleuth store. So this is for detectives only. So he kept me busy with his different initiatives. You know, this was what is on my mind now. Let's go do it. You know, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So he was different, but he was fun. He had such an easy temperament with all his activity. He was very, very easy.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and is it true? I thought I heard somewhere that people gave him stocks for his bar mitzvah gift because he liked stock trading.
That's true, because people think of him as this academic lawyer. So when he had different careers. When he was about 12 or 13, he actually wanted to be a rabbi because he always liked the Jewish tradition, and he was more, you know, observant. It was a very important part of his life. And at the same period, about a year later, he got very interested. It actually came a little bit at the same time that he didn't go to summer camp one year, and he went and he was on one of these programs in Cambridge, England, where he learned finance. He must have been already 15 years old. And he came back and he had very, very strong interest in the stock market, but this had been going on for a few years. And he did that. And then, you know, he got interested in writing, and then he got interested in law. So he had phases, right? He traveled through life, and he had traveled through interests of different nature.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And you also called him Bozo for quite a number of years.
That is true. He was Danny. It was Danny when he lived in Montreal and Toronto until he was 17, 18. And then when he went to Harvard, he was Dan. Okay, so this was his name. He shortened it. But his nickname from when he was younger, because I told you what he was a character, was Bozo. But he would call my office and say Bozo called, but he wouldn't say Danny anymore. That was where he was quite unique.
At Dan's loss. We met him in college and have been friends ever since. An anecdote. We haven't crossed paths much in the last couple of years, but I sent out a mass email for a fundraiser about 2 weeks ago. Dan was the first person to respond with a donation about 1 minute after I sent the email. We will miss you. Yer Lista King, July 21st, 2014.
The next one was previously posted, but I will pick up where there was an addition made. I did not typically see Dan very frequently in person, maybe 2 or 3 times a year or so when he was passing through New York City. With Dan, however, it did not take much FaceTime to maintain close friendships. Like an ounce of gold spread across a church dome, Dan seemed to make tiny snippets of time count in maintaining friendships with literally hundreds of people in his orbit of friends, held together by an occasional email, a quick bite at a bar, a few words at Crim Law Theory Conference or Prof's Blog Fest. He was like a human Grand Central Station, bustling with extraordinary energy to bring people together, using his blog in a self-effacing way to connect with people, to connect people with books, jobs, ideas, each other. When someone like Dan is torn out of the web, it leaves a lot of loose ends. Rick Hills, July 21st, 2014.
Dan was a true mensch and a great guy. Posted by Zev Agan, July 21st, 2014.
Dan was a rigorous academic and a kind friend. This tragedy is unspeakable. I hope his family can find comfort in one another during this terrible time. Thank you for allowing us to comfort one another in this online Shiva. Nicole Huberfeld, July 21st, 2014.
This is devastating. Dan was such a lively presence in the world. My thoughts are with his family, and especially his kids. Posted by Bill Areza, July 21st, 2014.
All I can do is add to the mosaic of thoughts from people who knew Dan much better. Danny was a guy who would take the initiative to help you out on things big and small. I won't forget his kind words and advice. Reflecting over the past few days, I realized that we should take a few lessons from Dan to heart. One of them is that we don't know how much a little bit of kindness and generosity here and there can affect people in the aggregate. Just read everything above and on his Facebook page. We should honor him by trying to do more of that in our own lives. I vividly recall Dan arriving at the ASU conference for junior faculty in 2011, wearing his super cool sunglasses at the spring training baseball game. I jokingly asked him if he was a little bit old for hanging around with us newbies. I'm a year older than Dan. He laughed and said, "I'll never, ever be too old for this." Oh, the cruelty of it all. That's how I'll remember him. David Friedman, July 21st, 2014.
This is incredibly sad news. Dan was warm, devout, generous, kind, even to those who could do nothing for him, and always confident. And he really loved those boys. Just heartbreaking. Samuel Bray, July 21st, 2014.
From Jay Michelson, thanks for saying so much of what it is, for me, still inarticulable. There's a link to comments about Dan Markel's meaningful life ends in a senseless death, posted by Emily Satterthwaite, July 21st, 2014.
What's truly amazing, as reflected in the remembrances here and elsewhere, is the sheer number of people whose lives Dan touched in a meaningful way. I had always thought of him as connected, but to say that now is to understate things so completely as to risk missing the mark entirely. I wasn't a close friend, but even so, I can say without a doubt that my career would not have been the same had my path not crossed his. What's overwhelming is how many others can say the same thing, and all of us in a meaningful way. I will honor his memory by trying to be better as a colleague, as a teacher, as a scholar, and as a dad. Posted by Chad Oldfather, July 21st, 2014.
I was so delighted when, years ago, Dan renewed friendship across the years and miles via Facebook. I knew Dan in Lowell House when he was an undergraduate at Harvard. There are no words to express our sadness at his death. Our thoughts and prayers are with him or with his family and friends. Tim Markey, July 22nd, 2014.
I only just heard of the senseless death of Dan Markel. Both Joseph and Lorna Lewis are terribly shocked. We have known the family for several years. Our prayers and thoughts are with them. Dan was such a fine young man. I am at loss for words. What a loss for those of us who knew him and loved him. May he rest in peace. Lorna Lewis, July 22nd, 2014.
I want to offer a personal, unusual perspective on Dan, which shines light on his character. Dan banned me from posting comments on profs in 2006. At the time, I was a squirrely, arrogant, big law associate who visited the site to procrastinate in the middle of the day, and I had neither hope nor desire for the academy. Consequently, when I thought a blog post was loony, I was happy to comment as much. What I did care, what a bunch of out-of-touch law professors thought. What did I care? What a bunch of out-of-touch law professors thought. That led to the blockage of my IP address. Later, as I matured and grew closer to the academy and started to offer thoughtful comments on profs, Dan never held anything against me. He surely had reason to hold a grudge. I sent him a snarky email after my banishment. Dan could have torpedoed my candidacy when I was on the market, but he did not. I enjoyed my subsequent job talks at FSU and still remember firmly shaking his hand. He gave me nothing but kind words before the big event. I should emphasize that I never made direct reparations for my prior behavior. Dan was just patient with me, as I developed as a human being and scholar. And once I started to engage thoughtfully rather than sardonically, he welcomed me. I never got to apologize to him. I did not get to know Dan as well as I liked. I enjoyed having dinner with him in Iowa City when he visited last, and we shared a late night beer with a small group at Seals, for which I now feel privileged. At the time, I sensed he was a little detached and distracted for reasons that now seem clear, but he still offered me nothing but honest advice and mentoring about building a scholarly profile. I've struggled to post this because I did not know Dan as well as others, and my shock and sadness surely pales in comparison to that felt by others. And I feel some guilt in making this post, because I think subconsciously I'm ultimately trying to handle feelings that I don't know what else to do with, and I'm not principally trying to make any type of meaningful contribution. But I think it's worthwhile for people to know that Dan extended his friendship and mentoring even to persons who did not deserve it. He was not a mere networker or schmoozer. I think he legitimately liked seeing people succeed, even if he watched the ascension of someone who was rude to him previously. I'm now entrenched enough in the legal academy to see that professors can be quite nasty to one another for even a trifle. But Dan never did anything to soil my career. He must have seen something in me that I didn't, and he gave me a chance. I'm forever grateful for that. Dan, please forgive another self-indulgent post from me. You will be missed. Andy, July 23rd, 2014.
Okay, this is a very short one, so I'll read this and then the next one. Would it be possible to post a mailing address to send cards for those of us unable to attend the funeral in Toronto? Posted by Tim Markey, July 23rd, 2014. And then the next one is, someone earlier said that Dan was a force of nature. That's how I feel as well. I admired Dan. He was intellectually involved with virtually every idea and person in criminal theory. He had original ideas, which he thought out to the roots and held with conviction. He saw clearly that the ideas were not just a matter of intellectual gamesmanship, but a matter of justice. He was decent. I think it might be clearest and simplest just to say he had a sense of justice, and he was kind. I'm younger and newer to the field of criminal theory than Dan, and I will always be grateful for the way he welcomed me into the fold. It is unbearably painful to think of what this crime means for his 2 children. I hope above all that those 2 boys will somehow find a way to live at peace with the memory of their father, remembering his love for them and knowing that he was a man of brilliance, goodness, and passion. Posted by Joshua Kleinfeld, July 24th, 2014.
I'd known Dan since law school. Dan was a great guy to talk ideas with, collegial but unsparing. He also lent a lot of people a hand, academically or otherwise, when there was quite obviously nothing in it for him. Danny, old friend, you will be missed. Brendan Maher, July 24th, 2014.
I'm so sad and shocked at this tragedy. Dan was such a generous and outgoing person, reaching out to everyone, and I love seeing his love for his children. My heart goes out to them and his family. Bethany Berger, July 24th, 2014.
Oh my God, I just saw this today in the ABA Journal, and I am glad I got to know you during our brief time at FSU, and I appreciate all of your helpfulness and kindness, both when I was there and afterwards. Rest in peace, Dan. You deserved better. Joe Leahy, July 25th, 2014.
I am shocked and saddened to hear this. I only knew Dan through my guest blogging on profs, but I just had to write a note to express my condolences. He was always so lively, energetic, witty, and smart on the blog, so I can only imagine how that must have paled to interacting with him in person. I will keep his family and friends in my prayers. Kelly Anders, July 25th, 2014.
Thoughts and prayers to Dan's family, hoping that justice is served. The legal community has truly lost a great teacher, Sean. August 8th, 2014.
For everyone who posted or considered posting above, a call for memories from Danny's family, from Shelley Markel, Danny's sister. Dear friends, we have been so appreciative of all the amazing tributes and memories shared about Danny, and we would really like to collect them all in one place. So we are sending out a call for memories of Danny. Please feel free to share this information. Written reflections, photos, video, audio, excerpts from correspondence are all welcomed. These will be made into a book and digital media compilation that we will share at an appropriate time with Danny's two boys, Benjamin and Lincoln. Please visit www.rememberingdanny.com to share your submissions with us. We'd also love to receive any videos you have of Danny and any video messages you may have or would like to create. For instructions on what to do with those larger files or any questions, please email us at rememberingdanmarkel@gmail.com. Thank you. The Markel Family, posted by Emily Satterthwaite, August 28th, 2014. Okay, so that's that one web page, and then we'll move on to the other Prof's blog page.
Sure.
Okay.
For Monday, July 4th, 2016, a belated eulogy of sorts. Before I begin blogging in earnest, I would be remiss if I didn't say something about Dan, given that I haven't blogged here since before his death almost 2 years ago. I'm a little hesitant to offer any kind of eulogy, not just because it's so late in the day, but also because I'm not sure I can say anything about Dan that hasn't been said before, with much more eloquence than I can muster. In addition, I didn't know Dan as well as some did. I had met him only a handful of times in real life, IRL as the kids say, including being on a panel with him about 5 summers ago. Nonetheless, the magic of the internet, blogging and Facebook, gave me the illusion that I knew him better than I actually did, and I knew him well enough to be utterly shaken to the bone upon hearing of his death. In any event, I don't think anyone will mind if I add a few thoughts. Something that surprised me in the days and weeks that followed that awful day was the realization that Dan was both younger than I and had entered academia a year after I had. He was one of those people who was such a mainstay of legal academia and seemed to fit there so well that he seemed to always have been there. Most of us need our first few years to get our feet wet and figure out what we're doing before we truly become engaged with others in the academic world. Dan seemed to hit the ground running, and I find that truly remarkable. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the subtle influence Dan has had on me in my role as Associate Dean for Faculty Development at my school, a role that I took on just after Dan died. In that kind of role, one has to strike a good balance between being a critic and being a cheerleader. Be too much of a critic and people will shut down and not listen. Be too much of a cheerleader and you're not helping people improve. I feel like Dan struck that balance quite well. He had a way, at least in my limited experience with him, of cutting the heart of things and exposing the flaws in your work, but doing it in such a way that you could still feel good about your work and yourself, and you had a desire to improve it. I'm still struggling to emulate him in that way. My thoughts these days are about Dan, not just because I'm blogging here again, and not just because of the recent breaks in his case, but because we are only a few days away from CrimFest, the conference that Dan created with Carissa Hessick. For several years, it had been a shadow conference within the Law and Society Association Conference, but Dan and Carissa decided in 2014 to establish it as a standalone conference. I don't know how many people realize this, but Dan died the day before CrimFest 2014 was supposed to start. Instead of looking forward to seeing him and our other colleagues in the criminal law, procedure, justice world, we were exchanging emails about whether the conference should go on at all. It did go on, and that was one awful plane ride. I felt as if I were headed to a funeral, not an academic conference. My mantra the whole day was, quote, "This is going to suck," end quote. And you know what? It didn't suck. There was a hastily but beautifully prepared memorial for Dan during lunch on the first full day of the conference, and many tears were shed. Some people offered brief memories of Dan as they began their presentations, but the conference went on as planned. And I know it's cliche, but it's also true. That was the best way of honoring him. CrimFest 2016, those who knew him better than I have said that Dan would insist on the exclamation point, begins coming Sunday. CrimFest has become a mainstay of the academic world for us criminal law, procedure, justice folks, and it has become the highlight of my year from a professional standpoint. I hope it will be with us years and decades to come, and I believe it will. The two-day exchange of ideas, both formal and informal, the camaraderie of a cohort who all speak the same language, the warmth of catching up with old friends and welcoming new faces into the club, and, of course, the socializing, whether over bagels or beer. It's all so Dan. Posted Michael J.Z. Mannheimer on July 4th, 2016.
Sunday, October 4th, 2015. Leaving Profs. Today is the 10th anniversary of my first post on Profs. I started the day after the Harriet Myers nomination, the nomination that launched the blogosphere. I was only a guest blogger, but then this happened, and Dan invited me to stay on permanently. It has been a wonderful experience. I cannot imagine where I would be right now in my career without Dan and Profs. Blogging here enabled me to be a part of the national conversation with other scholars and future FTC commissioners on the controversies of the day. It got me to meet and cyber meet a lot of really interesting law profs through book clubs, the Research Canons Project, open source casebook conversations, everyday blogging, and the profs and co-sponsors happy hours that Dan masterminded. I never made a Profs Fest, which I really regret, but as part of the Profs community, I met a lot more folks than I ever would have met otherwise in the academy. The last few years have been tough for law students, law schools, and law profs. And the last year has been particularly hard as we continue to mourn Dan's absence. The profs community has stayed strong in Dan's memory, and I know that site will continue to offer a place for raw profs, young and old, to meet, greet, tell us a little about themselves and their work, and make connections within the national community. It is with sadness, then, that I tell you that I am leaving Prof's blog. I will be joining the conglomerate to do more blogging on corporate and employment law issues. I haven't done much blogging in the past year, and I haven't done much subject area blogging in much longer than that. And I've probably done too much blogging about law schools and the issues they face. If you're interested in some of my bigger picture perspectives, you can check out Funding Legal Scholarship and Law Students and Legal Scholarship, both of which started as blog posts here. And I continue to think that AALS should be a bigger player here, even in the face of Dean Rodriguez's naysaying. So this is a goodbye, at least in my capacity as perma-prof. I look forward to profs sticking around for at least a few more decades, serving as a place for folks in the law school universe to share ideas, concerns, and sentiments. And I look forward to participating in that community. Thanks to everyone here for their hard work and generosity of spirit. And one more thanks to you, Dan. You are the root for all that has followed. Posted by Matt Bodie on October 4th, 2015.
Remembering Dan. I distinctly remember beginning my workday a year ago and coming across the news of Dan's death. I was in complete shock. As so many people have attested to since Dan's death, he was larger than life. Every time I saw Dan, he always had a million pieces of advice and was overflowing with life. This was even more unique for me because I actually hadn't spent much time with Dan. Only a brief encounter with him was enough to make him part of your life somehow. After he was gone, I realized that everyone had this experience with him. He was just so full of life that I can't believe it has been a year since he's been gone. It seemed only fitting to remember him on this blog and hope that his 2 boys grow up thriving as he would have wanted. Lee Osofsky, July 20th, 2015.
Okay, so the next one would be Monday, November 3rd, 2014, Returning to Profs and Remembering Dan. I'm excited to be guest blogging again at Profs. Like many have expressed over the past few months, guest blogging this time around is far more personal after Dan's tragic death over the summer. Since then, I find myself thinking about and quoting Dan often. I share his advice with students and colleagues alike, and participating in the community that Dan created is a reminder of the extraordinary world he created, of which many of us are the beneficiaries. So with that, I look forward to another month here at Profs. I plan to spend much of my stint here talking about my favorite topic, the intersection of religion and private law. So here comes a month of religious contracts, religious torts, and religious arbitration. Looking forward to comments posted by Michael Helfand on November 3rd, 2014.
Signing off. As I wrap up my stint on Prof's blog, I'm grateful for having had the opportunity to share my ideas with a very thoughtful readership. And as I continue to read the insightful posts of Prof's blog, many terrific contributors, I am grateful for the daily reminders of Dan Markel's exceptional legacy as a legal scholar. David Orentlicher, November 2nd, 2014.
Okay, so I think that's the end of what we're going to be reading from the Prof's blog, which is still viewable on the website. And next,
maybe the October 1st.
Oh, is there another one?
Yeah, I could do it, or you.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Quack. Over the summer, my friend Dan Markel invited me to be a guest at this blog. I was probably one of hundreds who received that twice yearly call for guest bloggers. Yet another example of how many people floated in Danny's orbit. It had been years since I had blogged, but I decided to respond to this request this time because I wanted to write a little bit about Catalanello versus Kramer, a defamation lawsuit in which I served grudgingly as the defendant. Current guest blogger Jeffrey Rapp blogged about the case back in April of 2013. I do have thoughts on the case, what was at stake, what I learned from the process, how I came to love the concept academic freedom, and maybe I'll get to them while I'm here this month. But it feels wrong not to say something about Danny first. Danny was one of my friends in the academy. We met on the tennis court at Seals, and Danny absorbed me into his life immediately. He introduced me to people, invited me to conferences, demanded to read my work, shared my work with others, and called me to regularly check in. He was relentless. In a significant sense, he taught me how to be a good law professor. Not good in terms of the quality of my teachings and writing, though I'm confident he helped me become a better writer and reader, but in terms of our obligations to the community. Mentorship is the lifeblood of the legal academy. Academic life can be a solitary existence. My phone doesn't ring that often. If I want to, I can spend all the workday all by myself, holed up in my office, not responding to knocks at the door. But I don't, because that's not how you do the job. We are at our best when we treat this job like a collective enterprise. Give as much as you take and make time for the community. That is how Danny did the job. And like a baby duck, I imprinted on him. I suspect that many of us did. Thanks to the rest of Prof's blog crew for hosting me this month. Quack. Zachary Kramer, October 1st, 2014.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to switch over to a really nice article that was written on abovethelaw.com by Dan's friend from his Harvard undergrad days, David Latt, who has reported extensively about the case. So hopefully that is showing up here. Okay. I'll just go ahead and read the title and the first little paragraph then. It says, Professor Dan Markel, Some Personal Recollections. What do friends and former colleagues of Professor Dan Markel have to say about him? By David Ladd on July 21st, 2014. As I mentioned in my earlier story about the horrific killing of Professor Dan Markel, I knew Dan since our days working together on the Harvard Crimson. Back then, he was Dan E. Markel, 95, and I was David B. Latt, 96. We both wrote columns and would edit each other's work. We didn't often agree. I was even more conservative back then, and he was, well, not conservative, but we respected each other's thinking and writing.
After graduating from Harvard College, AB, Cambridge University in Philadelphia, and Harvard Law School, JD.
Philosophy.
Oh, philosophy. Thank you. And Harvard Law School, JD. Dan went on to have a tremendous career in law practice and teaching. He clerked for Judge Michael Daley Hawkins on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and worked as an associate at Kellogg Huber, the insanely elite D.C. litigation boutique. He then joined the faculty of the Florida State University College of Law, where at the time of his death, he held an endowed chair as D'Alembert Professor of Law. A prolific scholar in the areas of criminal law and punishment, he published numerous law review articles, pieces for general interest news outlets like the New York Times and Slate, and a book, Privilege or Punish, Criminal Justice and the Challenge of Family Ties.
But Dan was much more than the sum of his resume items. Here are some testimonials and memories from myself and others who knew him.
Dan's death came as a shock to his friends and family. The past year or so hadn't been easy for Dan in the wake of his divorce from Wendi Adelson, but things seemed to be looking up for him as reported by the Toronto Star.
New York University law professor Rick Hills Jr. last saw Markel when the Florida resident stayed with him in New York just 2 weeks ago.
Markel had not told many of his friends yet, but he told Hills that he was happy in a new relationship with a woman after going through a divorce with the mother of his children in the past 2 years, Hills said.
He was rebuilding his life after a really, really difficult period, Hills said. I was watching him as he was in my apartment, Skyping his kids and saying goodnight on his cell phone. He was so happy.
I hadn't spoken with Dan in a while, not since some point last year, but a mutual friend had emailed with him this past Wednesday, and nothing seemed to be amiss. So when the news of his death started spreading like wildfire over the weekend, we were all floored.
Tributes to Dan appear through the legal blogosphere, and Professor Paul Caron has collected many here. This is not surprising, given that Dan was a pioneer in the world of legal blogging. He and I entered the blogosphere around the same time. I started underneath their robes in 2004. He launched Prof's blog in 2005. Above the Law debuted in 2006, and unlike many other bloggers who dabbled and then departed, Dan kept at it. He wrote his last post for Prof's blog just this past Wednesday, an analysis of the Jones v. Chappelle death penalty opinion.
But it wasn't just Dan's blogging that made his loss reverberate so much throughout the blogosphere. It was also his scholarship, his teachings, and his generosity with his time to both students and colleagues. Here's what one FSU alum wrote to us. I was one of his students the first year he taught at FSU. He was a fantastic professor.
Here's what Professor Michael McCann shared with me. I appreciate you writing on Dan's death. Your story captured the horror of what's going on. Like everyone else, I'm stunned and shocked and desperately trying to figure out how this could happen. I've known Dan for almost 10 years, and we were co-authoring a forthcoming sports law article in the Harvard Journal of Sports and Entertainment Law. Thank you for writing about him and bringing national attention to his life. He was a remarkable guy and a true pioneer in both the legal academy and the blogosphere. His legacy will only grow as more and more legal commentary takes place online rather than in print.
I like how Professor Dave Hoffman put it at Concurring Opinions. Dan Markel had many friends. You, the reader, know that if you had been surfing the Law Professor blogosphere, which is full of tributes, notes of gratitude and sadness, and a residue of shock and disbelief. Indeed, Dan Markel knew more legal academics, by which I mean he had more meaningful conversations and was actually friends with more people than anyone in the country. Everyone knew him or had a story about him, even conversations he wasn't a part of, at conferences he'd never attended. He was a common point of reference. He was our Kevin Bacon. I've been friends with Dan since law school. He gave me comments on my first paper. They were tough. Quote, "Why are you writing a 25-page literature review that no one, including you, will care to read?" End quote. But write. And he gave me tough comments on my second paper. Again, he was right. And my third paper, and my fourth. He didn't stop when it became obvious that he was also giving hours of time weekly to literally dozens of other people's work, when he was blessed with 2 younger sons, when he built an active intellectual life at FSU, where he undertook a brutal travel schedule. He gave of himself, despite writing scores of articles and books and op-eds and drafts and more articles of his own. His unselfishness and rigor were daunting. Where did he find the time, the energy?
Here's what I like about Hoffman's tribute. It captures Dan in all his candor and complexity. Death can have a leveling effect where we speak of the deceased in a blandly uniform way. Brilliant, kind, generous, loving. Dan was all of these things, yes, but Hoffman's tribute preserves the Dan-ness of Dan.
Dan was brilliant, yes, and he was blunt, tough, as noted by Hoffman. Dan was opinionated and outspoken. He wasn't a wallflower. He wasn't vanilla ice cream, and he was committed to excellence, which he demanded from himself and from others. That rubbed some people the wrong way, but to those of us who could take it, he was an invaluable source of honest perspectives.
Consider, for example, his prof's blog post reacting to the launch of Above the Law, which, for the record, has evolved a lot in the 8 years we've been around. Despite our friendship, Dan didn't pull his punches, calling our site design, long since superseded, quote, gruesome to the eyes, unquote, and questioning the appropriateness of ATL treating legal world niche celebrities like bona fide celebrities or all-purpose public figures. You could always count on Dan for honest and insightful comments.
Here are 2 stories about Dan that show the kind of person he was. One goes back to his days as a law clerk, and one is much more recent. Dan and I both clerked on the Ninth Circuit, although for different judges at different times. Dan clerked for Judge Michael Daley Hawkins in 2001 to 2002. Here's a story about Dan that is now part of Ninth Circuit lore.
With a few notable exceptions, such as Chief Judge Alex Kozinski, judges on the Ninth Circuit generally use a system of pooled bench memos, where one law clerk in one judge's chambers writes a bench memo that gets shared with the 2 other judges on the panel hearing the case. Not unlike the Supreme Court cert pool, this approach greatly increases efficiency by reducing duplication of work. You don't end up with 3 bench memos for the same case, but it can create problems. For example, if the bench memos coming out of one judge's chambers aren't up to the standards of the other judges, or if they take an overly political approach to analyzing a case.
When bench memos from other chambers turn out to be subpar, the usual response of clerks on the receiving end is to ignore the shoddy work product and prepare a better analysis to provide internally to one's own judge. Conventional wisdom is that it's not the place of the clerk to judge X to reprimand the clerks to judge Y for weak work product. That's Judge Y's prerogative. But Dan saw things a little differently. After the clerks from another chambers produced bench memos that turned out to be below average, Dan walked up to the clerks from the offending chambers at oral argument and expressed disappointment in them for what he viewed as inadequate bench memos.
Impolitic? Yes. A breach of protocol? Certainly. And Judge Hawkins reprimanded Dan for it after finding out. But the incident also captures the kind of person Dan was, the total opposite of a, quote, that's not my problem, unquote, or, quote, who cares, unquote, kind of guy. If someone else had a problem, a student struggling with a difficult concept, a fellow law professor having a hard time placing an article, a blogger going down a misguided analytical path, it became Dan's problem. He cared so deeply, maybe even to a fault, about people and ideas and the entire world around him. It makes perfect sense that his scholarship focused on justice. Dan simply couldn't abide injustice.
For the record, this controversy over the bench memos didn't prevent Dan from winning the respect and admiration of Judge Hawkins. As another former Hawkins clerk told me, Dan, quote, was one of the judge's favorite former clerks. He spoke of him highly and often, end quote. I did reach out to Judge Hawkins for comment on Dan. The judge didn't comment on the bench memo incident, but he did offer these words.
Dan Markel was a fabulous clerk, smart, hardworking, and very disciplined. He wrote with clarity and purpose. He was the law clerk on a 2002 habeas case arising from the home invasion, robbery, murder of a Sacramento area businessman, in which the Ninth Circuit found that the state prosecutors had withheld clear exculpatory evidence and granted relief. United States versus Killian, Ninth Circuit, 2002. The case was recently featured on the CNN series Death Row Stories. The segment is titled Ride to the Rescue. I consider each of my former clerks to be my favorite, and Dan was no exception. Our Chambers family grieves at the loss of this talented young man.
Here's my second story about Dan. One time, he called me because a friend of his was indirectly implicated in a story we were working on, and Dan wanted to make sure that his friend, a good guy and an innocent party, did not get unfairly dragged into the embarrassing mess. Dan successfully persuaded me to leave his friend out of the final story. Dan didn't have to get involved. He had nothing to do with the story, which was about a law firm rather than a law school. But he did, making the case on behalf of his friend, because he wanted to make sure that we did the right thing. He wanted to make sure that people were treated fairly and that justice was done.
That captures who Dan Markel was, someone who wanted to make sure that justice was done. And that's why his passing is such a great loss for his family, for the FSU community, for the legal academy as a whole, and for those of us lucky to call him a friend.
Professor Markel's scholarship develops a new theory of retributive justice for liberal democracies and applies that theory in particular to topics such as the proper scope of mercy, the death penalty, punitive damages, shaming punishments, and transitional justice in states recovering from mass atrocities.
His work has been published in leading law reviews, and he also has written for or appeared as a commentator in a wide variety of national and international mass media. Raised in Toronto, he studied politics and philosophy as an undergraduate at Harvard. He then did graduate work in political philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the University of Cambridge before returning to Harvard for his law degree, where he was an Olin Fellow and on law review. Upon graduation from law school, Professor Markel was a research fellow at the Berkman Center at Harvard Law School, a clerk for Judge Michael Daley Hawkins on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and an associate at Kellogg, Huber, Hansen, Todd, Evans, and Feigl in Washington, D.C., where he practiced white-collar criminal defense and civil litigation in trial and appellate courts. He teaches primarily in the area of criminal law. Okay.
Very fond of Danny from the beginning. I thought he was funny. He could certainly needle you and kind of push you on issues. He and I we saw eye to eye on a lot of things, but we had different political views on things, and so we would talk about that from time to time. He would, he liked to push to get good conversation going, and he was a very conscientious person, always checked in on friends. He was one of those people that like never missed the opportunity to congratulate you on something or wish you a happy birthday. And I've mentioned it before, my birthday's the day after his. So there was, it was always kind of like a happy birthday, my almost birthday twin, kind of things like that. And just a really good guy and certainly brilliant. I mean, extremely brilliant.
Yeah. So have you seen those negative comments about him on YouTube? Like, how did that make you feel when you would see these strangers saying
it's
bad
bothersome.
things?
It's extremely bothersome because people want to talk about him who don't know him. And they do always say that you tend to glorify people after they die. And I'm sure that there's, some of that goes on as well. But, people like to say that he treated Wendi poorly and all this. And beyond her saying that, I don't know anyone that ever saw that. Donna and Wendi seem to be the only ones that ever say that. I never witnessed him treating her poorly. And again, you don't know what goes on behind closed doors in someone's marriage. And anyone who's married knows marriage is tough and it's not perfect. And there are always ups and downs. But it just, the things that I hear or read on YouTube or other places, they do not tend to correspond with the person that I knew.
Yeah. Well, did they seem pretty happy most of the time before the separation?
Yeah, I mean, especially if you ever go back and I don't know if it's still there, but man, his Facebook page, I know his Facebook page is still there, but I don't know if all the posts from pre-divorce, or if he cleared them out. But they were always just glowing about Mrs. Bear and the Cubs, and that's what they called each other, and all of it about his amazing wife and his two kids. And I mean, it would be hard to think anything other than he was happy. And that's why when I found out that they were separated and that they were getting divorced, I was shocked because I mean, I never saw it. And it's funny because not funny, but I remember hearing, and maybe it was when Wendi did that writing podcast, and she talked about how no one ever knew she was unhappy. And I guess, she guesses she did a good job of hiding it. And she did, because no one ever did know she was unhappy. We spoke. I ran into him a couple of times. I actually had done, this would have been probably shortly, it would have been the spring of 2014. I'm trying to think. If it was the spring of 2014, I was asked to speak on a panel at the law school. And I actually ran into him while I was there at the law school, and I spoke to him for quite a bit. And and it was one of those, oh, let's catch up, let's grab something to eat sometime, and for sure. And as life tends to be, my wife was at the time pregnant with our second child. I had I guess a 3-year-old at home at the time, and he had 2 young kids. You always say, hey, have your people call my people, and you tend to lose track of time. And a couple months later, it was too late for us to have that lunch that we had planned on.
So that was your last interaction with him?
My last in-person interaction, yes. We actually communicated on Facebook not too long after that. I think I had a question I had to ask him. It was something law school related. And we spoke on Facebook Messenger for a little bit. But then after that, that was probably the last time we spoke. And that would have probably been April or May of 2014.
Yeah. So how did you find out that he had been shot?
So I first heard about the shooting on Trescott and that afternoon. I had been in a meeting at my office in the morning, and I went back into my office and pulled up TallahasseeDemocrat.com, and I saw that there was an article about a shooting, and I looked and it was on Trescott. And so I called my wife, who works for the state, and I said, hey, did you see the Democrat? There was a shooting. She goes, I just heard something about it. I said, well, it was on Trescott. That's where Danny and Wendi lived when they were married. And at the time, I didn't know that Danny was still living in that house. So I said, gosh, I hope everything's okay. I wonder if he still lives there. And she's like, I don't know. And I didn't even think, you can look that up on the property appraiser's website, but, just kind of went about the rest of my day. The next morning, I woke up and I saw a friend of mine, Tamara Demko, had posted on Facebook about it being Danny. She had posted something about how, she couldn't believe it. And I kind of went into shock, and I went into the room. My wife, I mentioned she was pregnant. She was actually like ready to give birth pregnant at this point. And I went into the bedroom and I said, oh my gosh, it was Danny. And she said, what was Danny? And I said, it was Danny who got shot. And she she looked up at me and she said, it was a hit. And I was like, no. And she goes, 100% it was a hit. And it just, and I've told this story a few times since then. It makes the hairs on my arms stand up, because she just knew right away, partially because she's a criminal appeals attorney. So she reads about this stuff all the time and deals with it. But also she just had this intuition that that's what had occurred. And sadly, I was wrong and she was right. It certainly was.
Well, what about your bigger circle of mutual friends? Did they also suspect the Adelsons soon afterwards?
I think that it was kind of split. I think that there were a lot of people that probably did, and then there were others that didn't want to believe that it could happen that way. I think I fall into the category of I did not want to believe that someone that I had been friends with for so long, that her or her family could have anything to do with it. And what people have to remember is that in 2014, when this happened, we didn't have the benefit of going back and now watching Wendy's initial interview with police. We didn't know about Sigfredo Garcia and Luis Rivera. We didn't know anything about Catherine Magbanua. So for at least 2 years, all we knew was that Danny had been shot, had died, and that there was a Prius that might have been involved. That's really all we knew. And we all knew Wendi didn't have a Prius, nor did Charlie, for that matter. So, I mean, we really did not have the benefit of knowing what the Tallahassee Police Department knew. And they didn't even know all that much at the time. So we're going off of the fact that Danny had been shot and killed, and that's all we knew. And so, your heart and your mind want to believe that a friend of yours could never be involved in this. Now, looking back, there's a lot of weirdness and things like that. Like, I've told the story a couple times that shortly after, it would have been September of 2014, Wendi randomly reached out to me. It was on Google Messenger, which, GChat or whatever it was called back then. And it was just a weird conversation. Like, she kind of at first pretended like maybe I didn't know what happened, which, I mean, I live in Tallahassee. You knew what happened. Meaning like I didn't even know that Danny got shot. And then she was like, well, wait, now that I think about it, didn't I see you at the memorial? And so, I mean, it was just kind of a weird interaction. And then, I reached out to some mutual friends to see if they had talked to Wendi or seen her, since she moved to South Florida. And, you know, one of them had mentioned to me, yeah, she's doing fine. You know, obviously there's, you know, she's just focused on the boys right now and all that. But it always kind of just stuck on me that like she never seemed like too upset about things. You know, it was kind of like, all right, I'm going to move on with my life. I don't
Yeah,
know.
pack up and
I
move.
yeah, I wouldn't have been able to move on that quickly.
Mhm. I mean, didn't you think it was kind of weird that they had just been in this kind of divorce custody case and she
Yeah,
wanted to move, and then
yeah,
bam, 3 days later they drive off and don't talk to the police again.
yeah. And again, back then though, we didn't know that she didn't talk to the police through, you know, like
Yeah.
right after it happened. I knew, and I, you know, probably would have done the same thing in her shoes. I knew she was in South Florida. And I knew that because a mutual friend and I talked probably about, you know, 4 or 5 days later. You know, and she said she had flown down and she was with her and you know, making sure she was okay. But I didn't think anything suspicious of going down to South Florida right away. You want to be around your family and all that. What's suspicious now looking back is she never came back. She went down to South Florida, and other than her coming up here for those trials, I don't think she's been back to Tallahassee at all. Um, so that is one of those, you know, red flags to me now in hindsight, thinking there's no way like she wasn't somehow involved in this.
Hey, what about, well, didn't a tree fall on Dan's house that fall? Do you think Wendy came back to deal with that? Or
No, you talking about the fall after he had been killed?
killed? Yes,
No,
I've heard.
I don't know. I don't know about that. I could probably go back and look. But no, I don't think she'd come back here to deal with anything. She probably would have had someone else deal with that. I do know that once they were able to, that the house was put on the market. I actually have friends who, when they moved to Tallahassee, they actually were shown that house and didn't know it at the time what had happened in the house, but you know, afterwards they were like, "Oh, we're glad we didn't buy that one."
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. I saw that the house sold at a big decrease
yeah.
or price cut. Yeah. Well, so you mentioned that you did go to the memorial service for Dan. What was that like?
Yeah, it was emotional and kind of surreal. You know, I've tried to I don't think I've ever had another friend of mine murdered, thankfully. So to go to a memorial service for a friend who had just been shot and killed is very weird, very surreal and emotional. I went by myself. My wife was at home, like I said. My son was born. That was July 20th. It was Sunday, July 20th. Trying to think. Yes, Sunday, July 20th was the memorial. My son was born July 22nd. So like that's
Oh,
how close my wife
oh,
was to giving birth.
oh,
So she couldn't go. She just was not feeling up to it. And I pulled in. It was hard to find parking. I remember that. There were a lot of people. And I pulled in and I ran into a friend of mine who was another lobbyist for the state who had Danny as a professor. And so it was nice to see a familiar face and be able to, you know, sit with her and just, you know, kind of talk. And we were both still in shock. I think everybody was. I remember when the Markels walked in, I got just this awful feeling. Like I can't even imagine what they're feeling right now. And then I remember Wendy coming into the room, and she just had this like deer in headlights look. I don't know if I would say it was shock or it certainly wasn't sadness. You know, I would have expected just and I know that they were divorced and I know that they didn't get along, but at the same time, that's the father of your children. And so for me, I would have thought that she would have been just an emotional wreck, but she came in holding the hand of one of the kids, carrying the other, and just kind of made her way to where she sat. And it was just a very surreal experience.
Did she speak at that service?
No, no. And I don't remember her speaking to a whole lot of people either. I know I never spoke to her, and that's kind of what prompted that whole later on that September of 2014 online conversation we had. But no, I don't remember her seeing her really speak to anyone. Maybe her parents, and that was it.
Did you think when she contacted you in September that she was digging for information?
You know, I never thought about it then, and I really never thought about it until you just asked that question. It's very possible. She knew my wife was an appellate attorney, a criminal appellate attorney. She knew that she had ties to the state's attorney's office. So I don't know, maybe she was. And she also knew that I was very, and I say this, and it sounds much more arrogant than it's meant to be, but that I'm connected in Tallahassee. I know a lot of people. And so maybe she was digging. Maybe she wanted me to say, something like, hey, nobody here or nobody involved thinks it was you or anything like that, which I didn't say to her. But maybe she was digging. I never thought of that until it's a good question.
Because I'm just thinking it seems kind of weird that out of the blue,
It was
what was
random,
it, 2 months
totally
later?
random.
Because
Yeah.
it sounds like you weren't that close to her.
We were, and we were close prior to that, particularly like I would say before we both had kids. When you have kids, and they go to their preschools, you tend to get in with who their little friends are and do play dates and things like that. And
Yeah.
because our kids were at different preschools, we didn't see each other all that much. But it was very weird for her to reach out to me that way. It wouldn't have been weird if, hey, I heard you're in South Florida or so, or hey, I ran into your parents and it made me think of you or something like that, because my parents are still in South Florida, so that would have been entirely possible. Or she could have, run into a mutual friend, like the one who introduced us. But it wasn't anything like that. I still have the conversation. I went back and looked at it. I'm like, totally unprompted. It was the first thing she said was, "Hi, Jared." And it was just like, not like, "Hey, I ran into so and so and we were talking about you," or nothing like that. It was just so random.
So that's the last time you communicated?
That's the last time we spoke one-on-one, as far as communication with each other. I did get an email. I can't remember exactly when it was. It might have been 2016. But it was more of a mass email, and it was about the Adelsons telling their side of the story. It was an email that I got from Wendi that was like, "Hey, we really appreciate all your support over the years, and please click this link for my side of the story," or something like that. Again, that was weird too, that she would send that out, and I know it was sent to, multiple people, not to me directly, but it was a very strange, statement, and all about how the Adelsons want nothing but the killers to be caught and prosecuted and all that. So it was just, again, it very weird.
That PR piece that was sort of drafted by attorneys
Yeah,
went to the media.
yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure that was the same thing. Yeah. And then, like, maybe occasionally, I'd get a message on Facebook for a happy birthday or something like that. But other than that, I hadn't talked to her probably since September 2014. I'll just say again, I say this a lot, and a lot of people refer to this as the Adelson case and the Adelson trials. And let's always remember that this is the Danny Markel trial, the Danny Markel murder. Let's always make it about him, because he's the victim, and the Markels as a whole are the victim. And Danny if you were friends with him on Facebook, you ever got a chance to read through, those boys were his life. I mean, just the things I remember every day, there was another post about how amazing his two boys were and how much they meant to him. And that's what I'll remember about Danny the most, is how much he loved those boys. And as a father myself, you know, I've got two kids. I love them dearly. And I try and model how much I adore my kids, like he did his, because he truly, look, people can say whatever they want about him. And, you know, we talked about it a little earlier about negative comments about him, that may be out there, but I've never heard anyone say anything about negatively about how he was as a father. That's, you know, that's the most important thing. And so everyone needs to really remember that. And that's why we always say one of the biggest tragedies of this is Ruth and Phil not having the time with those boys that they deserve, so that they can make sure that those boys knew how much Danny loved them. And so if I have one goal through all of this, you know, this isn't about me. The only reason I speak out is so that my friends, you know, memory and scholarship is preserved, and that, you know, justice for Dan truly is brought. But if I have one goal, it's that one day, these kids may stumble upon a YouTube video that I may have done, or someone else may have done, and that they hear their father, Danny Markel, they were his life, for the 3 and 4 years that he had with them. That 3 or 4 years that he had with them, that was an eternity for him, and that's what mattered most.
And so I certainly was going to go meet with him. But when I met with him, it totally changed my mind. He was very easy to talk to. He was not a firebrand. He was not, you know, kind of out of control, which I was afraid of. You know, I was afraid that this was a person who had a very acrimonious divorce, and he was still harboring a lot of residual hurt and anger and was inflammatory. That wasn't the case. He was very cool. Not really necessarily what you might think of in a law professor, especially not one with his background. And he was funny. He was real affable. Like we really laughed, and I just felt like I was making a friend as opposed to just getting a client. I certainly didn't expect that to happen. So he convinced me. Once he started to talk, he convinced me that he had the evidence to prove that Wendi had not been honest in a lot of her filings. And it was enough for me to believe that the courts would understand Dan's position as long as it was presented the right way. He was very, 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 very easy to talk to. We laughed. I mean, we would laugh, talk, and just kind of talk about being dads and things like that more than we would really the case. And we were drafting some stuff that I had recommended. That was the direction we needed to go. And he was always available, but except when he was with his children. If he was with his sons, and I've said this before, and it's the truth, and I'll say it every time I have a chance to talk about Dan Markel, I'm going to talk about the father that he was, because he absolutely inspired me to be a far better father. He changed the way I look at life and fatherhood altogether. I'm not saying I ever lived up to the standard he set, but it was certainly something to aspire to. But I remember one time I called, and it was a call that we needed to have, and it was important to him. But as soon as he answered the phone, he said, "I'm with the boys at the park. I'll call you back." And he hung up. I said, "Okay." You know what I mean? And it just kind of reinforced everything that he had demonstrated to me up to that point about where his passions lied and what he cared about and what he treasured. And it was the children. So he was surprisingly easy to work with for me. And so when the police called me to ask me how I knew Dan Markel, because I had called him probably probably 18 minutes after he was killed, 15 minutes after he was killed, I was calling him back so we could finish our papers. And I had told Wendy's lawyer we were going to be filing something that day, that once I filed it, I was worried that we would no longer be able to try to calm things down and maybe resolve the case short of going to a formal hearing. And so, yeah, that was that I never, when the police called, that's what I thought it was about. It's an officer that I knew, that I had stored in my phone. I had worked with her in the past on some stuff. And when she called, I said, "Hey, Annie, how you doing?" And she said, how do you know Dan Markel?" And I said, "What? How do you know Dan Markel?" And she like barked it. And I was like, she's in cop mode right now. Like, this isn't Annie calling me, on a side issue. And so I immediately went into lawyer mode. And I thought, and I knew Annie at the time worked in violent crimes. And so I thought, oh my gosh, she did it. She made up some bogus allegation against Dan. And I said, "Well, he's my client. I want to speak to him." And she said, "You can't." I said, "No, I can. I represent him right now in an active proceeding. I want to talk to him." And I could tell at that point, Annie, like, you could just sense it over the phone. I can't describe it, but she said, "You can't, because something really bad has happened." And then at that moment, I knew they killed him, or somebody had killed him. I don't know why my mind went there the way it did. Part of it was Annie's tone. At that point, it all made a lot more sense, because Annie was a pretty high-ranking officer in the Tallahassee Police Department. Even if Wendi had made a bogus allegation of battery, Annie wouldn't have been calling me.
Yeah.
It would have been some, if anybody called me, it would have been a patrol type officer. But then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm on his phone calling him, and something's happened to him, and I just knew they had killed him. And that's why she's calling me, to probably make sure I wasn't a suspect at that point. Absolutely believe that they were involved. The family was involved. I didn't know exactly who, but I didn't believe it was. I just knew it wasn't random. I mean, like, I don't know why. Before she even told me he was dead, she just said something really bad has happened, and I just knew. And my first thing was, oh my gosh, they killed him. I can still feel it, remember it, and it was crazy. It's still crazy. If I woke up this morning and Dan Markel was still alive and it was all a dream, it would make more sense to me. The past 10 years, and we were at a baseball tournament for my son, and I was just like in a daze. It stayed that way. I stayed that way for weeks. I remember I was sitting, we'd come back, it was well over a week, and we'd come back, and I was in my office, and I was back in the conference room, and I was supposed to be working on something. And I was literally just sitting there staring at the papers, thinking about it, and unaware that I was doing that. And the receptionist buzzed me on the conference phone and kind of snapped me out of it. And she said, "There's a doctor's office in Miami that wants to talk to you about Dan Markel." And I said, "Okay." So I grabbed the phone, and at that point, I didn't know Wendi had already moved, right? Like, and they said, "Hey, it's our understanding that you represent the father." I was like, "Well, I did." And the mother's here, and she wants to get treatment with the boys, but we need the consent. And I said, "Well, I don't know what authority I have. I'm pretty sure I have zero authority." But by the same token, I said, "Look, but if these kids need treatment, then treat them. I'll take whatever the fallout is, that comes from that. I'll accept it, the consequences. You have my consent. You have my permission. Like, whatever authority I have, you have it." And the woman, she was like, No, it's not like that. It's not urgent. The mother just wants to change their primary care physician from the doctor in Tallahassee to the doctor down here in Miami. And you could have literally knocked me over with a feather. I could not believe it. I was sitting in my conference room, still in a daze, unable to focus on my practice and my work that I needed to do because I couldn't stop thinking about how he was murdered. I just couldn't get over it. And meanwhile, Wendi is out just going through mundane tasks, changing primary care physicians as if nothing really had happened. I can't describe it, but I don't know, man. It did something to me. Dan's murder just still can't shake it, you know, like still 10 years later. It's just palpable because of who they killed. You know, they literally murdered the greatest father I've ever had an opportunity to meet. And in a world where there aren't enough great fathers, there aren't enough good fathers, to take away one of the best fathers that those two boys could have ever been birthed into and with, it's just it's an injustice to those boys that it haunts me. I would just like to say I'm sorry that I have gone on podcasts and said things that probably caused you pain when I talked about Wendi, Charlie, Donna, Harvey, people I know that you love. And I'm sorry for that. Sorry I caused you any pain. But by the same token, I was your father's advocate when he was alive and when he was murdered. And I'm going to be your father's advocate until I am no longer alive. And the main thrust of my advocacy for your father now is trying to make sure that you know, contrary to whatever you may have heard, he was an amazing father. He loved you more than anything. And no father has ever loved children more than your dad loved you. And that's really why I feel like it's important for me to go out and try to speak, because I hope and pray that you will know that. You know, your mother has gone on the record saying that, you know, she tried to continue to foster a love between you and for your father. And I hope that's true. But no matter what, it's the only thing I can do. The only value I think I can really add is to try to make sure that the world knows. And hopefully one day you boys will hear this from me. And if you didn't know it, you'll open your minds and your hearts to it, because man, he loved you. He loved you.